On a quiet Tuesday evening in a small suburban neighborhood, the streets were mostly empty except for a few passing cars and the gentle rustling of autumn leaves. The local bank's ATM vestibule cast a fluorescent glow onto the sidewalk as an elderly gentleman, a retired Marine Corps veteran of 79 years, made his way toward the entrance. Mr. Chen, as his neighbors knew him, had lived in the community for over 4 decades. His measured steps and straightened posture reflected his military background, even though his hair had long since turned silver. He'd made this same trip to the ATM countless times before, usually to withdraw money for his weekly groceries and to send some to his grandchildren for their college funds. As he inserted his card into the machine, his weathered fingers moved with practiced precision across the keypad. The cool air from the vestibule's air conditioning provided a welcome respite from the humid evening air. What Mr. Chen didn't notice was the shadow that had been trailing him for the past 2 blocks, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The would-be mugger, a man in his mid-20s wearing a dark hoodie, had been observing the ATM location for several hours. He'd chosen this particular spot because it was partially hidden from the main street's view by an overgrown hedge. In his mind, an elderly man would make an easy target, someone who wouldn't put up much of a fight. As the cash dispenser whirred to life, Mr. Chen felt an unexpected presence behind him. Before he could turn around, a gruff voice demanded, "Hand over the money, old man. Don't try anything stupid." The young man had pulled up his hood and pressed what felt like a sharp object against Mr. Chen's back. What happened next would later become the talk of the neighborhood for months to come. Instead of trembling or fumbling with his wallet as the mugger had expected, Mr. Chen remained unnaturally calm. His decades of military training hadn't faded with age, they had merely been dormant, waiting for a moment like this. "Son," Mr. Chen said in a steady voice that carried the weight of his years, "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away." His words weren't delivered as a threat but as genuine advice from someone who had seen enough violence in his lifetime to know its consequences. The mugger laughed, pressing the object harder against Mr. Chen's back. "Shut up and give me the money, Grandpa. I don't want to hurt you, but I will." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his nervousness despite attempting to sound threatening. In that split second, Mr. Chen's mind flashed back to his training days in the Marine Corps. He remembered his instructor's words about situational awareness and how the element of surprise could turn any situation in your favor. Despite his age, his muscles remembered what his mind had never forgotten. With a fluidity that defied his years, Mr. Chen shifted his weight and moved slightly to his left, just enough to throw off his attacker's balance. The movement was so subtle that the mugger didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. In one smooth motion, Mr. Chen grabbed the wrist holding the weapon, which turned out to be nothing more than a wooden stick, and twisted it away. The young man's eyes widened in shock as he found himself being expertly maneuvered into a hold that left him gasping for air. Mr. Chen had him pinned against the ATM wall, using leverage rather than strength to keep him immobile. The entire sequence had taken less than 5 seconds. "I gave you a chance," Mr. Chen said calmly, maintaining the hold while reaching for his phone. "Now we're going to wait here until the police arrive." The mugger struggled briefly but quickly realized that any movement only made the hold more uncomfortable. A young couple walking their dog noticed the commotion and immediately called 911. Within minutes, police sirens could be heard approaching the scene. As they waited, Mr. Chen began talking to his would-be attacker, not with anger or contempt, but with the kind of wisdom that only comes from a life fully lived. "I've seen too many young men throw their lives away," he said, his voice carrying a hint of sadness. "Whatever brought you to this point, there are better paths forward." The mugger, who had stopped struggling, remained silent but seemed to be listening. When the police arrived, they found an unusual scene. An elderly gentleman calmly holding a young man in a military restraining technique while giving him life advice. The responding officers, one of whom was a veteran himself, immediately recognized the technique and couldn't help but smile at the situation. As the police took the mugger into custody, one of the officers asked Mr. Chen if he wanted to press charges. His response surprised everyone present. "Only if you can ensure he gets into a rehabilitation program," he said. "This young man needs guidance more than he needs punishment." The incident might have ended there, but its impact on the community was just beginning. Local news reporters caught wind of the story, and soon Mr. Chen's act of skilled self-defense combined with compassion became a talking point throughout the region. However, he remained humble about the whole situation, continuing his daily routines as if nothing extraordinary had happened. In the days that followed, neighbors who had known Mr. Chen for years began seeing him in a new light. They'd always known him as the quiet elderly gentleman who tended his garden and helped kids fix their bicycles. Now they understood that beneath his gentle exterior lay the heart and skills of a Marine who had never forgotten his training or his commitment to protecting others. The story spread through the community, not just as a tale of an elderly man defending himself, but as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that true strength often comes paired with wisdom and compassion. Mr. Chen's response to the situation had demonstrated both physical capability and moral character, turning what could have been a tragic incident into a moment of potential transformation for everyone involved. The day after the incident, Mr. Chen's phone wouldn't stop ringing. His daughter, upon hearing about what happened, insisted on coming over to check on him. Despite his repeated assurances that he was perfectly fine, she arrived at his doorstep with containers of homemade soup and concern written all over her face. "Dad, you could have been hurt," she said, arranging the food in his kitchen while he sat at the table, sipping his morning tea with his usual calmness. "You're not as young as you used to be." Mr. Chen simply smiled, the kind of smile that carried decades of unspoken stories. "Age is just a number," he replied, watching steam rise from his cup. "What matters is how you carry yourself in critical moments." His daughter shook her head, but there was pride mixed with her worry. She'd grown up hearing stories about her father's military service but had never witnessed his capabilities firsthand. Meanwhile, at the local police station, the young mugger sat in an interview room, still trying to process what had happened. Officer Thompson, a veteran himself, sat across from him, reviewing his file. The young man's name was Ray, and his story was unfortunately familiar, a series of small crimes escalating from shoplifting to attempted robbery, all stemming from a struggle with substance abuse. What surprised Officer Thompson was Ray's demeanor. Usually, arrested individuals showed anger or defiance, but Ray seemed lost in thought, occasionally touching his shoulder where Mr. Chen had held him. "He could have really hurt me," Ray said suddenly, breaking the silence. "But he didn't. He talked to me like I mattered." The officer leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. "The man you tried to rob, he's requested something specific for your case." Ray looked up, expecting the worst. "He's willing to not press charges if you agree to enter a rehabilitation program and participate in community service." Back in the neighborhood, Mr. Chen's daily routine continued, though with some noticeable changes. His regular morning walks now drew waves and greetings from neighbors who had previously barely noticed him. Parents would point him out to their children, telling them about the elderly hero who lived among them. At the local coffee shop, where he enjoyed his afternoon break, the owner refused to let him pay for his drinks. "You're making our neighborhood safer," she insisted, sliding his usual green tea across the counter. Mr. Chen tried to protest, but she wouldn't hear of it. "You're showing us that we can stand up for ourselves, no matter our age." A week after the incident, the local community center reached out to Mr. Chen with an unusual request. They wanted him to teach a self-defense class for seniors. At first, he hesitated, preferring his quiet life, but something about the idea resonated with him. He thought about all the elderly people who lived in fear of becoming victims, and how his experience could help them feel more confident. The first class attracted more participants than anyone expected. 20 seniors, ranging from their 60s to their 80s, filled the community center's multipurpose room, all eager to learn from the man they'd heard about on the local news. Mr. Chen began not with techniques, but with principles. Self-defense isn't about fighting, he explained to his attentive audience. It's about awareness, confidence, and making smart decisions. He demonstrated simple but effective moves that didn't require strength or speed, emphasizing the importance of avoiding dangerous situations in the first place. As word spread about his classes, something unexpected began to happen. Younger people started showing up to watch and learn. Among them was Officer Thompson, who occasionally stopped by to observe. He noticed how Mr. Chen's teachings went beyond physical techniques. He was sharing wisdom about respect, responsibility, and the importance of community. One morning, as Mr. Chen tended to his garden, a familiar figure approached his fence. It was Ray, looking nervous but determined, accompanied by Officer Thompson. The young man had been in rehabilitation for 2 weeks and had specifically requested to speak with Mr. Chen. "Sir," Ray began, his voice shaky but sincere, "I wanted to apologize face to face." Mr. Chen stood up slowly, brushing soil from his hands. "I've been thinking about what you said that night, about better paths forward. I'm trying to find mine now." Mr. Chen studied the young man's face, seeing something different from the desperate person he'd encountered at the ATM. "Would you like to help me with these tomatoes?" he asked, gesturing to his garden. "They need staking, and my old hands could use some help." Officer Thompson watched as the unlikely pair worked side by side in the garden, the elderly veteran teaching the young man about nurturing life from the soil. It was a powerful image, two people who could have been enemies, instead finding common ground among the growing things. The story of Mr. Chen and Ray's transformation began to attract attention beyond their small community. Local newspapers ran features about second chances and the power of compassion. But what really caught people's imagination was how an attempted crime had led to something positive, a strengthening of community bonds and a reminder that it's never too late to change direction in life. Mr. Chen's self-defense classes continued to grow, evolving into something more than just physical instruction. They became a place where seniors shared their experiences and supported each other. Some participants reported feeling more confident just walking down the street, knowing they had tools to protect themselves if needed. Ray, continuing his rehabilitation program, started volunteering at the community center where Mr. Chen taught. He helped set up the room for classes and occasionally shared his story with troubled youth, hoping to prevent them from making the same mistakes he had. As autumn turned to winter, the incident at the ATM seemed like a distant memory, but its ripple effects continued to influence the community. Mr. Chen's daughter noticed how her father seemed more energized, more engaged with life than he had been in years. Teaching and mentoring had given him a new purpose. As winter settled in, the community center buzzed with activity. Mr. Chen's self-defense classes had become so popular that they had to move to a larger space. But more remarkable was what happened before and after these sessions. People started coming early and staying late, sharing stories, offering support, and building connections that extended far beyond self-defense techniques. One snowy morning, Ray arrived at the community center earlier than usual. He found Mr. Chen setting up the room, carefully arranging safety mats on the floor. Without a word, Ray began helping, a routine they'd fallen into over the past few months. As they worked, Ray cleared his throat nervously. "I got the job," he said quietly. Mr. Chen paused, a mat still in his hands. "The one at the youth center. They said my experience, my story, could help other kids avoid the path I took." Mr. Chen's face broke into a warm smile, the kind that reached his eyes and created tiny wrinkles at their corners. "A job is like a seed," Mr. Chen replied, setting down the mat. "It needs nurturing to grow into something meaningful." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Which reminds me, I have something for you." Inside was a certificate for a basic self-defense instructor course. "You've learned enough from my classes. Perhaps it's time you started teaching others." Ray stared at the certificate, his hands trembling slightly. 6 months ago, he'd been desperate enough to try robbing an elderly man at an ATM. Now, he was being offered a chance to teach alongside the very man he'd attempted to rob. The irony wasn't lost on him. The local police department had taken notice of the positive changes happening at the community center. Officer Thompson, who had become a regular visitor, approached Mr. Chen with a proposal. The department wanted to start a program connecting troubled youth with community mentors, and they hoped Mr. Chen would help design it. "Your approach with Ray," Officer Thompson explained during their meeting, "it's exactly what we need. Not just teaching self-defense, but building confidence, responsibility, and respect." Mr. Chen listened thoughtfully, sipping his tea as the officer outlined the program. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. Parents whose children were struggling with behavioral issues began reaching out. They'd heard about Ray's transformation and hoped their own kids might benefit from similar guidance. Mr. Chen found himself becoming not just a self-defense instructor, but a bridge between generations. One particularly cold afternoon, a group of teenagers shuffled into the community center, led by their school counselor. They were labeled at-risk youth by the system, but Mr. Chen saw something different. He saw young people carrying heavy burdens, much like Ray had been. Ray was there that day, helping with the class. As the teenagers watched him demonstrate techniques with Mr. Chen, their initial skepticism began to fade. During the water break, one of them approached Ray. "Is it true what they say?" the young teen asked. "About you trying to rob him?" Ray nodded, not proud of his past but no longer ashamed to use it as a teaching tool. "So why is he helping you now?" "Because he saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself," Ray replied, watching Mr. Chen chat with other students. "Sometimes, one person believing in you is all it takes to change your whole life." The success of the program caught the attention of neighboring communities. Other police departments began sending officers to observe and learn. Mr. Chen's approach, combining physical training with mentorship and community building, was proving to be a powerful tool for positive change. Local businesses started getting involved too. The coffee shop owner who had once insisted on giving Mr. Chen free tea now provided refreshments for the youth programs. Other businesses offered job training and internship opportunities to program participants who showed commitment to changing their lives. Mr. Chen's daughter visited one day to watch a class. She sat quietly in the back, observing her father work with a group of seniors in the morning and troubled youth in the afternoon. She noticed how he adapted his teaching style for each group while maintaining the same core message about respect and responsibility. "You've built something amazing here, Dad," she told him later over dinner. "But aren't you tired? You're not getting any younger." Mr. Chen chuckled, his eyes twinkling with the same spirit that had helped him handle that attempted robbery months ago. "When you find purpose," he replied, serving her more soup, "it gives you energy. These young people, they remind me of the soldiers I trained years ago. They need someone to believe in them, to show them their own strength." The local news did a follow-up story on Mr. Chen and Ray's story, focusing on how one incident had sparked a community-wide movement. The reporter interviewed several program participants, including some of the teenagers who had initially been skeptical. "Before coming here, I was angry all the time," one young participant said during the interview. "Mr. Chen taught me that true strength isn't about fighting, it's about having the wisdom to avoid conflict and the courage to help others." As spring approached, the community center announced plans to expand its programs. They needed more space to accommodate the growing number of participants and activities. A fundraising campaign was launched, and the response was overwhelming. Local businesses, residents, and even neighboring communities contributed. Ray, now certified as an assistant instructor, had started leading his own beginner classes. He incorporated his personal story into his teaching, using his past mistakes to help others make better choices. The young people related to him in a way they couldn't with other instructors, seeing in him a realistic example of change. Spring brought new energy to the community center's expanded programs. The renovated space, funded by community donations, now included a dedicated training area, a meditation room, and a small library filled with books on personal development and leadership. But more importantly, it brought new stories of transformation. One morning, as Mr. Chen supervised Ray teaching a youth class, a police car pulled up outside. Officer Thompson stepped out, accompanied by a young teenager who carried the same defeated look Ray had worn months ago. The boy had been caught shoplifting, but instead of pressing charges, the store owner had requested he be brought to Mr. Chen's program. "His name is Tommy," Officer Thompson explained quietly to Mr. Chen. "Third offense this month. His single mother works 2 jobs, and he's been spending too much time on the streets." Mr. Chen watched as Tommy stood awkwardly at the entrance, his shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. Ray, noticing the new arrival, called a water break for his class and approached Tommy. "You know," he said, keeping his voice casual, "I used to think the whole world was against me too." Tommy glanced up, surprised by the directness of Ray's words. "Want to help me set up some equipment while we talk?" Mr. Chen observed as Ray guided Tommy through the process of laying out training mats, sharing bits of his own story along the way. It was like watching a mirror of his own mentorship with Ray, now reflected in Ray's interaction with Tommy. The cycle of positive influence was expanding. The community center's success caught the attention of a state-level youth rehabilitation program. Representatives visited to observe their methods, particularly interested in how they combined physical training with mentorship. Mr. Chen found himself explaining his philosophy to officials in suits, who furiously took notes. "The physical techniques are just the beginning," he told them, watching Ray demonstrate a defensive stance to Tommy, who had become a regular attendee. "We're not teaching people how to fight. We're teaching them how to stand tall, how to carry themselves with dignity, how to make better choices." As the program grew, so did the challenges. Some parents were initially hesitant about their children training alongside former troubled youth like Ray. But their doubts usually faded after observing a single class. They saw how Ray's openness about his past mistakes made him a more effective mentor, especially for kids who felt misunderstood. One evening, after most students had left, Mr. Chen found Ray sitting alone in the meditation room. "I got a letter today," Ray said, holding up an envelope. "From the man whose store I robbed last year, before the ATM incident. He's offering me a part-time job in his shipping department." Mr. Chen sat down beside him, his movements still graceful despite his age. "Life has a way of coming full circle," he said. "When we show we're ready to change, opportunities appear." Ray nodded, fighting back tears. "But remember," Mr. Chen continued, "this opportunity isn't just about you anymore. Every choice you make now affects the young people who look up to you." The impact of their work extended beyond the community center's walls. Local schools began reporting improved behavior from students who attended the program. The police department noted a decrease in youth-related incidents in the neighborhoods where program participants lived. Tommy, who had started as a reluctant participant, began bringing his friends to the center. "It's not just about learning to protect yourself," he explained to them. "It's about finding people who believe in you." His mother noticed changes too. He was helping more at home, his grades were improving, and he'd stopped hanging out with his old crowd. Mr. Chen's daughter, seeing how the program had grown, quit her part-time job to help manage the administrative side of things. "Dad," she said one day, reviewing their growing waitlist, "we need to think about training more instructors. You and Ray can't handle all these classes alone." The solution came from an unexpected source. Several of the senior citizens from Mr. Chen's original self-defense classes volunteered to help with the younger groups. These elderly mentors, each with their own lifetime of experience, added a new dimension to the program. They shared stories of overcoming adversity, making tough choices, and learning from mistakes. One of these seniors was Mrs. Park, a retired school teacher in her 70s. She had initially come to the center feeling vulnerable after a near miss with a purse snatcher. Now, she helped run a homework support program for the youth participants, combining academic guidance with life lessons. When I was teaching, she told Mr. Chen, I could only help students during school hours. Here, we're helping whole families, whole communities. She gestured toward Tommy, who was helping a younger student with math problems while waiting for his training session. The local newspaper ran another feature story, this time focusing on the ripple effects of the program. They interviewed family members of participants, teachers, police officers, and business owners. The consensus was clear: something special was happening at the community center, something that went far beyond self-defense training. Summer arrived with an unexpected challenge for the community center. Word of their success had spread so widely that they were receiving requests from neighboring cities to help establish similar programs. Mr. Chen sat in his small office, surrounded by letters and emails from community leaders, all asking for guidance. We need to be careful, he told Ray during their morning planning session. Growing too fast could make us lose what makes this program special. Ray nodded, understanding perfectly. He'd seen firsthand how the personal connections, the individual attention, had made his own transformation possible. One particularly hot afternoon, a group of visitors from a nearby city's youth services department arrived to observe their methods. Among them was a social worker who had been dealing with troubled teens for over 2 decades. She watched intently as Tommy, now one of their success stories, helped Ray demonstrate techniques to a new group. I've seen many programs, she said to Mr. Chen afterward, but there's something different here. These kids aren't just going through the motions. They're truly engaged. Mr. Chen smiled, watching Tommy patiently explain a concept to a younger participant, showing the same care that Ray had once shown him. The center's impact was becoming measurable. The police department's latest statistics showed a 40% decrease in youth-related incidents in their area. School attendance rates had improved, and local businesses reported fewer instances of shoplifting. But for Mr. Chen, the real success stories were the small, daily transformations he witnessed. One such transformation involved a quiet girl named Joy, who barely spoke when she first arrived at the center. Her guidance counselor had recommended the program after discovering Joy was being bullied at school. For weeks, she would stand at the back of the class, barely participating. Everything changed when Mrs. Park, the retired teacher, noticed Joy's talent for art. She had been doodling beautiful designs in her notebook during break times. Mrs. Park suggested creating a mural on one of the center's walls, giving Joy the opportunity to lead a project for the first time in her life. The mural project became a collaboration between the youth participants and the senior citizens. Joy's design incorporated elements from both traditional martial arts and modern street art, symbolizing the bridge their program had built between generations. As she directed others in painting, her confidence grew visibly. Sometimes, Mr. Chen observed to his daughter as they watched the mural take shape, strength shows itself in unexpected ways. The mural became a talking point for visitors, with Joy proudly explaining its meaning to anyone who asked. The same girl who had once hidden in the back of classes was now speaking confidently to strangers. Ray's role at the center continued to evolve. He started a special program for teens who, like him, were struggling with substance abuse issues. His honesty about his past struggles, combined with his visible success in turning his life around, made him a powerful influence on these young people. You know what the hardest part is, he confided to Mr. Chen one evening after a particularly challenging session. Seeing myself in them. Remembering how it felt to think there was no way out. Mr. Chen placed a weathered hand on Ray's shoulder, proud of how far his former attacker had come. The center's expanded programs now included family counseling sessions, job training workshops, and even a small food pantry for participants' families in need. Local businesses, seeing the program's positive impact, continued to offer support through donations and job opportunities. Tommy's mother, who had initially been skeptical of the program, became one of its strongest advocates. She started a parent support group that met while their children trained. Before this program, she told other parents, "I was losing my son to the streets. Now, he's talking about going to college." One day, Officer Thompson brought unexpected news. The department was receiving inquiries from police forces in other cities about implementing similar community-based intervention programs. They wanted Mr. Chen and Ray to help train their officers in their approach. "Your method works," Officer Thompson explained. "It's not just about preventing crime. It's about building bridges between law enforcement and the community." The idea of training police officers brought the program full circle from that night at the ATM. The center began hosting monthly community dinners where participants, their families, local business owners, and police officers could share meals and stories. These gatherings became a symbol of how walls between different parts of the community had broken down. During one such dinner, Joy unveiled her completed mural. The entire room fell silent as they took in the massive artwork. It showed hands of different ages reaching toward each other, surrounded by symbols of growth and transformation. At the center was a simple message: change starts with connection. As autumn leaves began to fall, the community center faced an unexpected crisis. The city council announced budget cuts that would affect several local programs, including their youth initiatives. Mr. Chen sat in his office late one evening, reviewing their finances with his daughter and Ray. "We've helped so many people," Ray said, his voice filled with concern as he looked at the numbers. "We can't let this end now." He thought about Tommy, Joy, and dozens of other young people who had found hope within these walls. Mr. Chen remained calm, sipping his tea as he had done countless times before in challenging situations. "When I was in the Marines," he said thoughtfully, "we learned that obstacles are opportunities in disguise. We just need to look at them from the right angle." His daughter nodded, already pulling out her phone to contact local business owners who had benefited from their program's positive impact on the community. Word of the center's financial challenges spread quickly through their tight-knit community. The response was immediate and heartwarming. The coffee shop owner who had once given Mr. Chen free tea organized a fundraising event. Local restaurants offered to cater community dinners at cost. Former participants who had gone on to successful careers started a donation campaign. Tommy, now helping younger kids with their training, approached Mr. Chen with an idea. "What if we put on a demonstration?" he suggested. "Show everyone what we've learned, not just the self-defense stuff, but everything else too." His eyes lit up as he explained his vision for an event that would showcase the program's impact. The demonstration was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in the local high school gymnasium. As participants prepared, their different journeys became clear. Joy worked on a new mural backdrop for the event, incorporating photographs of the center's history. Senior citizens practiced alongside teenagers, showing how the program had bridged generational gaps. Local media arrived to cover the event, but what caught their attention wasn't just the physical demonstrations. It was the stories. Ray stood before the crowd, sharing his journey from would-be mugger to mentor. Tommy spoke about finding purpose instead of trouble. Joy, once too shy to speak up in class, confidently led a group demonstration. Mrs. Park organized a display showing the academic improvements of youth participants. "It's not just about keeping kids off the streets," she explained to visitors. "It's about giving them the tools to build better futures." She proudly pointed to college acceptance letters received by several program graduates. During the demonstration, Mr. Chen mostly stayed in the background, watching his students share what they'd learned. Officer Thompson, standing beside him, noticed his expression. "You know," the officer said, "that night at the ATM, you could have just taken him down and walked away. Instead, you started something that's changing the whole community." The event raised enough money to keep the program running, but it achieved something even more valuable. City council members who attended saw firsthand how the program had transformed lives. They began discussing ways to make the center a permanent part of the city's youth services. One council member, particularly moved by the demonstrations, approached Mr. Chen afterward. "My son," she admitted quietly, "he's been getting into trouble at school. Would there be space for him in your program?" Mr. Chen smiled, recognizing the humility it took for a public figure to ask for help. The success of the demonstration led to an unexpected opportunity. A documentary filmmaker who had attended the event asked to create a short film about the center's impact on the community. Mr. Chen was hesitant at first, preferring to work quietly, but Ray convinced him that sharing their story could help other communities start similar programs. The filming process brought out new stories that even regular participants hadn't known. They learned about a local shop owner who had hired 3 program graduates, about a former troublemaker who now mentored elementary school kids, about families that had been reunited through the center's influence. As cameras rolled, capturing daily life at the center, Mr. Chen reflected on how far they'd come from that night at the ATM. "Every person has a choice," he told the filmmaker during an interview. "But sometimes, they need someone to show them there's a choice to make." The documentary crew captured small, powerful moments: Joy teaching art to senior citizens, Tommy tutoring younger students, Ray leading a support group for teenagers. These quiet interactions, more than any dramatic transformations, showed the true heart of their program. The documentary's premiere at the local theater brought together faces both familiar and new. As Mr. Chen watched from his seat, surrounded by his students and community members, he saw their story unfold on the big screen. The filmmaker had captured something special, not just the transformations, but the daily moments of connection that made them possible. The film opened with security footage from that fateful night at the ATM, then dissolved into scenes of the present-day community center. The contrast was striking, from a moment of potential violence to scenes of healing and growth. Ray's face appeared on screen, speaking candidly about how that night had changed his life's direction. After the screening, a long line formed of people wanting to talk to Mr. Chen and his team. Among them was a group of teachers from an inner-city school district dealing with high dropout rates. "We've tried everything," one teacher explained, her voice tired but hopeful. "But watching this, seeing how you connect with these kids, it's different." The documentary began screening at community centers and schools across the state. Each showing brought new requests for guidance on starting similar programs. Mr. Chen and Ray found themselves traveling on weekends, sharing their experiences with other communities while ensuring their own center maintained its personal touch. One particularly meaningful screening took place at a juvenile detention center. As the young inmates watched Ray's story unfold on screen, the room fell silent. During the discussion afterward, one teenager raised his hand. "Everyone keeps telling us we've messed up our lives," he said, his voice shaking. "But that guy in the film, he was worse than most of us, and look at him now." Back at their center, the impact of the documentary brought new challenges. More people were showing up, hoping to be part of what they'd seen on screen. Mr. Chen worried about maintaining the program's intimate, family-like atmosphere while meeting the growing need for their services. The solution came from an unexpected source. Program graduates started returning to help. They had jobs and lives of their own now but wanted to give back. Tommy, who had recently started community college, dedicated his evenings to mentoring new participants. Joy, now a budding graphic designer, taught art classes that helped kids express their emotions. One morning, a surprise visitor arrived at the center. It was the young man who had been in juvenile detention during the documentary screening. Recently released, he had traveled 2 hours by bus to find them. "I watched that film every chance I got while I was inside," he told Ray. "I memorized every word you said about change being possible." The documentary also attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Mental health professionals began studying their methods, particularly interested in how physical training combined with mentorship helped participants process trauma and build resilience. Researchers from a local university proposed a study to measure the program's long-term impact on youth development. Mr. Chen found himself increasingly asked to speak at conferences and seminars. Though public speaking wasn't his favorite activity, he understood the importance of sharing their experience. "Our program works," he would tell audiences, "because we see the person behind the problem. We build trust before we try to teach." The film's message reached beyond traditional youth programs. Corporate HR departments began requesting workshops on building inclusive communities in the workplace. Law enforcement agencies wanted to learn about their approach to de-escalation and community building. Even military bases expressed interest in their rehabilitation methods. One day, as Mr. Chen watched Ray lead a session for new instructors from other cities, his daughter noted how their small response to an attempted robbery had grown into something far bigger. "You know, Dad," she said, "when you stopped Ray that night, you weren't just preventing a crime. You were starting a movement." The documentary's impact continued to ripple outward, but within the center, the daily work remained deeply personal. Every morning, Mr. Chen still arrived early to prepare the space, just as he had done from the beginning. He knew that while their methods could be taught, the heart of their success lay in genuine connections made one person at a time. 1 year after the documentary's release, the community center prepared for its first national conference. Representatives from over 50 cities would be attending to learn about their program. As Mr. Chen walked through the center that morning, he paused at Joy's mural, remembering how each person's story had added another layer to their shared journey. The conference was being held in the newly expanded community center, made possible by grants and donations that had poured in after the documentary. The original training area remained untouched. Mr. Chen had insisted on preserving the space where so many transformations had begun. But new classrooms and meeting spaces now surrounded it, like rings spreading from a pebble dropped in still water. Ray stood at the registration desk, welcoming visitors alongside Tommy and other program graduates. He wore the confidence of someone who had not only changed his own life but had helped others change theirs. Watching him, Mr. Chen thought about that night at the ATM, how a moment of potential tragedy had transformed into something so powerful. During the opening session, Mr. Chen shared the podium with his original self-defense class members, now instructors themselves. Mrs. Park spoke about how the program had evolved beyond its original scope, becoming a model for community transformation. "We don't just teach people to protect themselves," she explained. "We teach them to protect and lift up their entire community." The conference included practical demonstrations, but the most powerful moments came during the informal sharing sessions. Program graduates spoke about their journeys. Parents described watching their children transform from troubled teens to community leaders. Police officers shared how the program had changed their approach to youth intervention. During lunch break, Officer Thompson approached Mr. Chen with news. The young man from the juvenile detention center who had been so moved by the documentary was now working with the police department's youth outreach program. "He's doing for others what Ray did for him," Thompson said. "The ripple effect just keeps growing." The afternoon sessions focused on the program's core principles. Ray led a workshop on building trust with troubled youth. Joy demonstrated how art therapy had become an integral part of their approach. Tommy shared their peer mentoring methods. Each presentation emphasized the importance of treating every participant with dignity and respect. As Mr. Chen watched these sessions, he noticed something remarkable. The visitors weren't just taking notes, they were forming connections with each other, sharing resources and ideas, building a network of support that would extend far beyond the conference. During a break, his daughter found him sitting quietly in the original training room. "Remember when I used to worry about you doing too much?" she said, sitting beside him. "Now look at what you've created." Mr. Chen smiled, thinking of all the lives touched by their work. The conference's final day featured a special ceremony. Program graduates from the past year received recognition for their achievements. Among them was the council member's son, who had gone from troubled teen to peer mentor. As each graduate spoke, they emphasized how the program had given them not just skills, but a sense of belonging and purpose. In a surprise moment, Ray announced the creation of a scholarship fund named in Mr. Chen's honor. "This program taught us that everyone deserves a second chance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This fund will ensure that financial barriers never prevent someone from getting that chance." The fund's first recipient was Tommy, who had been accepted to a 4-year college. As he accepted the scholarship, he spoke about his journey from shoplifting to student leader. "Mr. Chen and Ray showed me that our past mistakes don't define us," he said. "It's what we choose to do next that matters." As the conference drew to a close, Mr. Chen stood at the podium one last time. Looking out at the faces before him, program graduates, current participants, visiting educators, law enforcement officers, and community leaders, he saw the future of their work. That night at the ATM, he began, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room, "I made a choice. Not just to defend myself, but to see the humanity in someone who meant me harm." Every day since then, we've all been making similar choices, to see the potential in each person who walks through our doors, to believe in second chances, to build bridges instead of walls. The applause that followed wasn't just for his words, it was for every life changed, every barrier broken, every connection made. As people began to leave, carrying their experiences back to their own communities, Mr. Chen knew that their work would continue to grow and evolve in new ways. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, Mr. Chen walked through the quiet center. He stopped at the ATM photo that hung in the entrance, a reminder of where it all began. Beside it now hung hundreds of photos showing transformations just as powerful as Ray's. Each one represented a choice, a moment when someone decided to change their path. As he turned out the lights and locked up for the night, Mr. Chen smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, and new opportunities for transformation. The program had grown far beyond what he'd imagined that night at the ATM, but its heart remained the same, one person reaching out to another, choosing compassion over fear, hope over despair, connection over conflict. The story of the elderly Marine and the would-be mugger had become something much bigger, a testament to the power of second chances and the possibility of change. But for Mr. Chen, success wasn't measured in programs replicated or conferences held. It was measured in the light he saw in people's eyes when they realized they could write a new chapter in their own story, just as he and Ray had done that fateful night at the ATM.